I want to, thank you everybody for joining us today. Today's discussion is going to be one of a series of events that CVI is doing for our annual Green Tie celebration. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us and learn about the work. And there's a lot more coming too. So just as a reminder, this evening at 6, we're going to turn the mic over to Inclusive Idaho and learn more about their work making our state more accessible to all. And tomorrow at noon Mountain Time, join our campaigns manager, Ann Zabala, to hear about how CVI affects Idaho's political landscape through redistricting and our upcoming elections. And then to top things off, we're going to celebrate tomorrow at 7 p.m. With our executive director, Regan Plumb, and some special guests to finish up our celebration and talk about our successes over the past year and what the future is going to look like for conservation in Idaho. You can get all these details about the events and other Green Tie festivities at cvidaho.org/green tie. Then before we begin, just a couple housekeeping things. You're all muted, and so if you have questions or comments, just submit those in the chat, and we've got staff here that'll be monitoring that to make sure that we can answer those questions. And if we don't get to your question or we don't get to address your comment, my contact information will be in the comment section also. So feel free to send me an email and I can absolutely follow up afterwards. Now let's go ahead and get started. So I'm Holly Condi. Welcome. I'm the Legislative and Public Lands Coordinator here at CVI. Our work is super heavily dependent on partnerships, and that's in all aspects of conservation. So I'm really excited today to hear from our panelists about how they've used collaborations in their organizations to specifically protect open space in Idaho. We certainly hear a lot about polarization and extremism, especially in the political arena. But in an increasingly divided world, conservation is becoming more collaborative. What we're seeing is stronger partnerships, and especially in Idaho and across the West, different user groups and different stakeholders, they come together to conserve open space and protect big landscapes. It's very much a collaborative environment. So today we've brought together 3 different perspectives on conservation. We've got public, private, and nonprofit. Sara Arkle is the open space manager for the City of Boise. Judy LaLonde is a private landowner who has decided to permanently protect her acreage near Troy, Idaho. And Regan Plumb is the conservation director with the Kaniksu Land Trust up in Sandpoint. So welcome to all of our panelists. To kick things off, I'm going to ask each of you to talk about how your organization is involved in open space conservation. What does that look like for you? I'm going to start with Sara. Go ahead, Sara, and kick it off for us.
All right, thanks, Holly. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk about this topic today because it is obviously what I've devoted my professional life to. So I've worked for the City of Boise now for 6 years. And in this role, I work on open space protection and critical habitat restoration and outdoor recreation, in addition to environmental education. So there's a little bit of everything in this work to try and teach the next generation of stewards for our city lands and manage them for their multiple uses. The City of Boise owns about 5,700 acres of open space reserve properties. Those properties were purchased mainly through the use of levy money that was collected in 2001 and then again in 2017. The first levy was passed in 2015, but we didn't collect it until a little later. So the City of Boise has raised $20 million for open space protection, and these were citizen-led initiatives. So we have a history here in the city of working with other land management agencies for the Ridge to Rivers Trail system to provide that outdoor recreation service to non-motorized recreationists. And we've worked with the community to continually raise funds and support for open space acquisition. And that's been driven by a desire within our community to protect those things that we identify with. Outdoor recreation being one of them, but also wildlife habitat and the view of the Boise foothills and the experience of the Boise River. So I think we're fortunate in this state, frankly, and obviously here in Boise, where folks really have a connection to our natural amenities and understand intrinsically that they are unique and valuable. So I kind of rambled a little bit, but I hope I answered your question.
You did, yeah, absolutely. That was a good answer, and it's a big question. So, Judy, same thing for you. Just if you could talk about how you were involved in open space conservation and what that looks like from a private landowner perspective.
I'm sitting on some 80 acres that my brother owned and I inherited. And it's interesting because I actually found this land for him when he was moving here from Boston. He passed away in 2008, and I knew about the Kaniksu Land Trust beforehand because I have some friends on the board and some people that have donated land. And I know my brother was quite interested in preserving this property. The city of Troy is kind of a bedroom. We're outside of Moscow, and Moscow keeps growing and growing. And of those acres that I have, at least 45 or so are in forest land. And so in order to preserve that forest land the way it is now, I turned it into a conservation easement with the help of the Kaniksu Land Trust. Part of that 45 acres had actually been subdivided into 12 residential lots. So I was able to get that out of residential into, the easement. And I'm so happy to be able to do so. It wasn't an especially inexpensive thing to do, but I thought it was worth it. I enjoy having students from the local school district and from the 2 universities that are close to Troy come out and do what they like to do, studying the water, studying the trees. Currently we're working on creating a trail through the woods for the citizens of Troy and other places to come and enjoy, walk and just enjoy being in nature and watching out for the deer and the moose and the birds, etc. Is that what you were looking for?
It was, and I'll ask you a little bit more about the students on your property in a bit, but first let's hear from Regan. If you want to talk about, how Kaniksu is involved in open space conservation, and maybe, Judy mentioned the Kaniksu Land Trust. Regan, if you could just kind of talk at a high level about what a land trust is for some folks too, that might be helpful.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, Judy's example was a great introduction because working with landowners like her is a huge part of our work. A land trust organization is a 501c3 nonprofit that is specially qualified to work in partnership with private landowners to develop conservation agreements that permanently restrict some of the uses on a property in order to preserve what we call its conservation values into the future. So these are completely voluntary agreements that are legally binding and intended to last in perpetuity. Each one of them is customized to the landowner that we work with and to the property that's being protected. So no two are alike, which is one of my favorite things about my job because no 2 projects are ever the same, for better or for worse. And once the terms of the conservation agreement are finalized, we have entered into a long-term partnership with that landowner, and the land trust's obligation in order to uphold the terms of the easement is to visit at least once a year stay in communication with the landowner. The conservation agreement, we say it runs with the land. So if Judy were to sell her property or gift it to somebody or transfer it to an heir at some point, that conservation agreement has been recorded with the title to her land, so it remains in effect regardless of future ownership. I like to illustrate that how that conservation agreement works with the analogy that if you own a parcel of land, it's like you have a box of pencils, and every pencil in that box represents a different right. So Judy has the right to log her forest, to build roads, to build additional homes, to invite the public in to explore, to manage it at will. And now that she has entered into this special agreement with Kaniksu Land Trust, she has essentially taken just one pencil out of that box, which represents the right to unrestricted subdivision and development. And there might be some other details, but she's handed that one pencil to this nonprofit, Kaniksu Land Trust, to hold, and the Kaniksu Land Trust will hold that pencil forever, which effectively retires that right. But Judy retains all the other rights of property ownership. So she still gets to enjoy her property, manage it in a sustainable way, gift it, sell it, lease it, transfer it, enjoy all the other rights of ownership. Kaniksu Land Trust has been working with landowners like Judy since 2002, and we work in the 2 northernmost counties in Idaho, and we also work across the border in northwest Montana in Sanders County. And we have worked with close to 30 different families like Judy's to develop these special conservation agreements to protect special places. We prioritize wildlife habitat working lands, including both forest land and farms and ranches. We also love to protect scenic vistas and important wildlife habitat and recreational access for the public. Now, it sounds like Judy has generously invited school groups and others to visit her property, but that's not necessarily implied in one of these conservation agreements. They don't just become public access lands, they're still private property, and we really hold dear the private property rights of the landowners that we work with. But Kaniksu, as part of our community work, has really taken a deep dive into trying to cultivate opportunities for public access to nature, because we understand that a lot of people who live in urban areas, and I include our little city of Sandpoint here, don't have ready access to the outdoors and all of the myriad benefits that come along with it to mental and physical and behavioral and emotional health. So we currently have 2 public access properties, one close to Sandpoint and one in Montana, and a 3rd project that's in the pipeline right now that we're hoping to open to the public next year. Is that a good start, Holly?
That's a great start. No, that's super exciting. I didn't know that Kaniksu did work in Montana, so I love learning stuff right off the bat. And I also want to point out that I love the pencil analogy. I will always love the pencil analogy, and it explains things so well. So thank you for using that one. Sara, I'm going to start off with a question for you. The City of Boise is known for its work, its extensive work in the foothills. What kind of partnerships are involved specific to foothills projects, and how do you approach collaboration on these projects? Like, what is your MO for making these things happen?
So there's kind of 2 tracks for work in the foothills when it comes to preservation and improvement of open space properties. One track is acquisition, and the other is what we might call improvement projects or restoration projects. And partnerships and collaboration are really the only way we get any of it done. I work with developers. My team works with developers. My team works with property owners. And we work with nonprofits like the Land Trust of the Treasure Valley and the Idaho Conservation League. And we work with businesses and volunteers for the improvement projects and the restoration work. Our team here is pretty lean and mean. We've got Martha Braybeck is our restoration ecologist. And just this year, we added a seasonal position to help with that work. But really, I mean, we have to be very targeted in where we do our restoration efforts because we rely heavily on volunteer assistance and the assistance of our partner organizations. I think your question is like, how do you approach, how do I approach those? How do we approach those partnerships? I think in any relationship that you're trying to develop, whether it's with a property owner or a developer or a nonprofit association, you kind of have to come with a full bucket of trust. So I'm pretty clear from the beginning, you know, here's what I'm trying to accomplish. Here's what I know your parameters are. Tell me if there are others that I'm unaware of. And let's try and do something really cool. You know, everybody's got different motivations. We have a neat little program here for, you know, restoring our open space lands called Weed Warriors, which was a way we could consider crowdsourcing invasive species management so that folks who are, you know, interested in native plants and native habitat can be empowered and informed in a way that allows them to go and, you know, pull invasive species, bag them, and take them out. And it's especially helpful when we have new emerging populations in some of our reserves to use that approach. And it also just, it gets people involved. And those folks, you know, they're intrinsically motivated. But you may have a developer that's not intrinsically motivated. And so just understanding what the policies are and the rules are and what our opportunities as a city are to work with developers and ask them to participate in maybe a more creative design that allows for public access or allows for the enhancement of native habitat. So trust is important. And I also think that just being, you know, open and honest about kind of where everybody's motivations lie is really helpful.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Having that trust and that open lines of communication, definitely a big part of making this work happen. Judy, you talked a little bit about your property. What can you expand on what motivated you to pursue a conservation easement, especially, you know, considering there is cost associated with these things. There's out-of-pocket costs, and they're not always, you know, the rewards. It's a lot of those intrinsic rewards that Sara was talking about. So if you could talk about, you know, why'd you do it? What took you down that path?
When my brother first moved out here, he brought a friend to stay with him for about a month from Boston, and she was working on a degree, and she actually surveyed the land and made up some plans to call it Big Meadow Creek Park. So I know from that preserving this land that we found so attractive was really a part of his wish. And I feel by making this easement, I've cherished what he desired from the first place. And it's just beautiful land. I love looking out at the forest and the birds that I have and seeing the deer come by. And I want that to be able for other people to be able to enjoy that. I'm lucky that there's a Big Meadow Creek runs through the property, and it actually, the Idaho Fish and Game are working on that creek and trying to restore steelhead access, or the steelhead that used to come through. And I was able to get some funds from them to help with the costs of making it a preservation, which was nice.
I love it. That's great. Steelhead, students, you've got a lot of wild things on that property. I love it. Regan, if you could walk us through the process at a kind of a high level of how a land trust completes a conservation project. What are the steps start to finish? You know, keeping in mind that, as you mentioned, every single conservation project is different, but what are the basic steps involved?
Well, the most important step is lots of listening and conversation with the landowner, just to ensure that their objectives are really closely aligned with the objectives of our organization. Occasionally, we are approached by a landowner who wants something that we can't provide, and we are very conscious of not entering into one of these agreements unless we feel that it's closely aligned with the mission of our organization, and it's something that we can stand behind for the long haul, because they're set up to be permanent agreements. So I generally start the conversation by asking a landowner, how would you like to see this property 100 years from now after we're all gone? And then we can kind of backtrack that vision as we draft the details of the conservation agreement, and it starts to evolve. And then there are lots of details, like sometimes there's survey work that's necessary to determine, to confirm where the boundaries of the property are, because our organization really needs to have a clear understanding of where the land is that we're promising to help protect forever. We established what we call a baseline document, which is a little snapshot of the condition of the property at the time that the agreement is granted. You know, how many buildings are there now? Is the property fenced? Is there a creek? What condition is the forest in? So that as things change over time, we always have this baseline of what it looked like in May of 2021 when the easement was granted. And then finally, we have a closing that's almost like a closing if you were to buy land. Or buy a property with the title company. We always purchase some degree of title insurance to make sure that we won't have any surprises down the road regarding exceptions on the title. And then that agreement is recorded with the title to the property, and we have a little celebration.
I was gonna say, you gotta have that celebration aspect, especially these projects can, sometimes they can take a long time, and it's absolutely worth celebrating at the end of a good project being completed, and especially celebrating that permanence. You know, as you mentioned, a lot of most conservation easements are permanent. It's permanent protections on the land, which is an important thing to remember. Sarah, going back to you, working on conservation projects for a municipality or a government entity is a little bit different, especially, you know, you mentioned the City of Boise uses taxpayer funds. We've had the levies that have passed. How do you demonstrate that projects are a good use of public funds?
Yeah, so working with public funds is really, really interesting, because you have, you know, a pretty good gauge based on the voting numbers as to what the support for the effort looks like. And in 2015, when we ran the second levy to raise $10 million for open space acquisition and improvement projects, the ballot language really defined the conservation criteria that we were seeking to apply those funds, for clean drinking water resources, critical habitat, recreational opportunities. So the reason for the funds is written in the ballot language, and we get good feedback based on the vote as to how popular this work is. And I'm trying to remember the exact percentage in 2015, but it was over a super majority. I think it was 72% or 68% or something. And I mean, you can see that every day. I'm sitting in the Foothills Learning Center right now, which is an environmental education facility. We provide learning opportunities for kids of all ages, whether you're, retired or in first grade or in preschool. And it's also sort of a gateway location for many miles of trails in the Rich River system. And people are enjoying those trails on the daily. We have pedestrian bike counters out at some key locations to help us get an estimate of usage. And in 2020, our trail use visits increased threefold. So I think, we can sort of take for granted in a certain sense that Boiseans and folks in the Treasure Valley really, really like having open space available for recreation and for those wildlife experiences that are unique to Idaho. And they want to continue to have those experiences available for their grandkids. And so our job as a team here at the city is to make sure that those funds that we spent conform to the goals of the ballot language. And we have a citizens advisory committee that helps make recommendations to council as to how those monies should be spent. And that's another kind of place where we can sort of gauge, you know, whether or not we're in alignment with what folks wanted to see these funds spent on. So there are some checks and balances, and there's also just really good widespread support for the work that we're doing.
Yeah, definitely. It's always interesting to see all the trail counters. You know, I've passed them before and been like, why is that little camera on the tree there? Oh, it's a trail counter.
And let me just tell you real quick, Holly, for those of you listening, it's not taking pictures of it. The
Right.
only thing that it's doing is registering somebody passing by. So there's no privacy issues. There's no big brother. We're just trying to get a sense of how many visits, anonymous. And some of the new counters, you can have the data break out bikers versus pedestrians. But in the ones that we've been using so far, it's just really like a tick, you know, somebody passes by, tick.
No, I'm glad that you pointed that out. That's true. It's just a little clicker. The city of Boise doesn't have pictures of people on the trails without their consent. So good to know. Thank you for pointing that out. Judy, can you talk about, you know, you mentioned having students come onto the property and using that as sort of a place of learning. Can you talk about how that partnership came to be, and is it a formal agreement with the school district, or is it something informal, and how did that come up?
It's pretty informal. Generally, a teacher, I think I've let the school district know I'm practically right across the street from, if you could talk about a street in this rural area, from the grade school and the high school. And so they're aware that I'm open to having students come over. So I'll have a teacher call me and say, you know, I want to bring a bunch of kids over to study the trees, the age of the trees, what kinds of trees we have. And I'll say, yep, sure, this is the way you get onto the land, no problem. I recently had a professor from the University of Idaho contact me, and he has an environmental science class, and they were studying water issues. And of course, the creek was quite attractive to them. They came out 3 different days from the city of Moscow and studied the water, what's in the water, what's around the water. So we have a very active FFA group also at the school, and they have come over for different things. So education is really important to me. So it's, I look for all the opportunities to have people with their students or alone. I've had a woman who was working on her own master's degree, and she came over and did some work with the stream. And that's very satisfying to me to be able to provide those opportunities.
Yeah, all levels of learning. I love it. And that kind of goes back to a reason that a lot of us do this work, right? Because of that connection to the land and because of that connection to, you know, whether it be the wildlife or the stream, whatever it is. When you start that connection young, when you're learning, it makes all the difference. Regan, that might be a good segue for you to talk about Pine Street Wood and that project.
Yeah, Pine Street Woods is sort of our flagship project here at Kaniksu Land Trust. It's something we're really proud of, and it's taken the support and engagement and participation of just a huge number of community members and partner groups to make it happen, which has been part of why it's so special. It came about, the vision for Pine Street Woods, which is a 180 acre community forest here just 2 miles from downtown Sandpoint. It was founded on the principles of conservation, education, and recreation for all members of the community. And it came out of a realization a number of years ago that although our private land conservation work with people like Judy will always be really integral to the heart of our organization, we are only serving a small segment of our community in that private land conservation work. A lot of people might not be conservation motivated, or they don't own land that has the conservation value that we're looking for. So how do we serve those people? And we started looking around and realized, land is really our specialty. And land can be a balm to address so many challenges in the community, whether it's health related or food scarcity, or just a place to connect with nature and unwind at the end of the day. Places for school groups to have experiential learning, place-based opportunities where they're learning directly from the natural world. So that really inspired us to embark on this project to acquire this fairly large, undeveloped parcel of land right on the outskirts of Sandpoint. And it took 6 or 8 years to raise. We had to raise over $2 million to make that acquisition, which was a huge lift for our little organization. We have about a full-time equivalent of about 3.5 staff people. It was a little smaller than that at the time. So Pine Street Woods, we were able to purchase in the spring of 2019 and open to the public in the fall of 2019. And the timing was just so essential, because when the pandemic happened a year ago, all of a sudden we found our community was just desperate for a place to be outdoors connecting with nature, because that was the one part of their lives that was normal, and that was how they were kind of being soothed and just coming to a more peaceful state of mind. So we amazingly, we have some cameras out that do take pictures, but they're so blurry that you can't recognize any details at all. But we estimate that we had over 20,000 visits to our Pine Street Woods property during the year 2020, which is huge for our community. We had people coming in from outside the area. I saw license plates from all over the country over the course of the year. So it was just exciting to see it resonating in that way with people here. Some I know people who said, I visited that property every single day in 2020, and that's how I got through such a crazy time in our lives. And again, the value of partnership in building that and reaching out to other organizations and asking, is this something that aligns with you? Is this would being a part of this help to build your organization? How can we work together to elevate this project and allow it to serve more people, was really a critical component.
Yeah, definitely. This has come up a couple of times, that especially during 2020, we saw exponential use of our outdoor spaces. And this is not just in Idaho, this is across the West. You see this in little communities or big communities with access to open space all over. The folks have really, really wanted to be outside. And with, increased numbers of people on the land, there is an increased need for stewardship as well. And this is open for any of the panelists who would like to speak to this, but how do you take a collaborative approach to stewardship? How do you take care of the land? Because that's absolutely an essential component of, making sure that these projects are healthy in the long run, that the landscape is healthy.
Is that to me, Holly?
That could be to you, Regan, or that could be to Sarah. Either one of you who wants to tackle that one. Well,
I'll start, Sarah. And Stewardship for us is a fairly collaborative process because within our office, we know a little bit about a lot of things, but we don't know a lot about many things. So Stewardship has given us the opportunity to reach out to community members who have much more expertise than we do. For example, right off the bat, when we acquired Pine Street Woods, it's a primarily wooded property, as the name implies. It's a community forest, and we knew that we wanted to have a really unique forest management plan to guide our management of that property. We knew that we didn't want it to be a profit-based management plan, that we wanted it to be founded on principles of forest health and wildlife habitat and fire mitigation. And we reached out to a number of career foresters we know in the area from both the public and private sectors. And they came together as a committee, toured the property on several occasions, and helped us to draft a really robust and innovative forest management plan to guide our care for the property. And there are other creative examples like that. It's just such an interesting opportunity to connect within your community and ask, how can you help us with this challenge? What would you do? Or what would you like to see? And engage people in that way.
Yeah, definitely. Maybe Sarah, you can take this on now too, especially in the lens that the foothills are a very different ecosystem than forested area up near Sandpoint. How in the foothills, how do you approach collaborative stewardship?
So we own in that 5,700 acres about that we own outright, City of Boise property. We span 4 different habitat types. Generally, most of that property is Great Basin sagebrush habitat. We also have riparian habitat, grasslands, and then we do own about 2,000 acres up at Stack Rock, which is forested. Not all of which is forested, but it's, there is some, over about 1,000 acres is forested. So our partnerships really match up and align, like Regan was saying, with kind of, who has expertise in each area. So whereas Martha, our restoration specialist, is focused on sagebrush restoration and the ecology of the sagebrush ecosystem and the grasslands that can support it. We reach out to partners like Forest Service, Idaho Department of Lands, to help us figure out, what are the appropriate forest health treatments that we need to be considering for the future. And that, I think, our restoration program is fairly new. In 2016, we hired Martha, and until then, it was a pretty light approach to management, just simply due to the fact that we had no resources to do so and no staff to do so. So we've been building a restoration program here that I'm pretty proud of, frankly, because it's quite robust, and it's robust because of the partnerships that we've built. I'll give you an example, a couple of examples that we're working on right now. Hulls Gulch is a ephemeral watershed here right by my office. And we've seen incision, we've seen invasive species like Russian olive trees invading. Over the course of the last 25 years, we've had a 4-fold increase in Russian olive trees. And they're, what Martha likes to say, ecological crap. They suck up a lot of water and they don't provide much benefit to wildlife. So we worked with Idaho Department of Fish and Game to get some design and installation of beaver dam analogs in the creek here. And then we worked with contractors and volunteer organizations like Micron sent out a group of volunteers, some other local businesses sent out volunteers to do some Russian olive tree removal. And so it's overall, I think we've removed 4 acres of Russian olive trees, and we are replacing those with 9 native shrub and tree species to try and promote wildlife habitat in, it's an ephemeral stream, but it's vital for wildlife in the foothills to have those water sources. So removing those trees and replacing it with native species helps to kind of restore that system so there's more water available. And those BDAs, those beaver dam analogs, are a really neat tool because it's easy for volunteers to create them, and they help slow that water down so that you don't continue to see incision, and you can kind of restore some stream bank habitat. Yeah, that's it.
Good answer. No, there's a lot. And I think, answers from all three of you throughout this discussion have been, yeah, we work with other agencies, we work with private landowners, we work with nonprofits, and it really demonstrates to me that it really takes all of us working together to protect these lands and to steward them, and to make sure that we're not losing all of our water, or to Russian olives drinking all the water for the other trees, or that our wildlife has a good place to live, and that folks have that recreation space that they've absolutely need, right? Especially, like we saw last year when folks needed it for their mental and spiritual and physical health. They needed to be able to go outside and enjoy open space. And it does, this discussion just drives home the point that it doesn't happen without a lot of collaboration. With that, I think we're about time for questions. So to any of our participants out there, if you've got questions, drop them in the question and answer box or in the chat box. And if I don't see any, what I'll do is just ask, if there's one takeaway from all of this, collaboration and conservation. Let me see, how do I want to put this? Like, what's your one takeaway about using collaboration to do conservation? And let's start with Regan, and we'll wait for questions to come in. So what's your takeaway about collaborating on conservation?
I think for me, it's keeping a really open mind. I love what Sara said about showing up with a bucket of trust and just reaching out in a really meaningful and authentic way, and then being prepared to be flexible and adaptive, because it's not always going to happen the way you anticipate it will, for better or for worse.
Yeah. Great. Judy?
It was interesting listening to you, Regan, discuss the how you go about with the land trust, because it was very familiar. I can't remember how many meetings we had, and to get started on this. And I wasn't very clear at the beginning of exactly what I wanted. And so things would go along, and a month or two would pass, and then I would get an email from somebody at the land trust saying, well, how about this? And it took several years, but it's been worth it. And I'm probably an unusual landowner in that in my will, I'm leaving all the property, not just the conservation easement, but the rest of the property to the land trust. I have a nice log house here, and I think it could serve as a nice meeting place or a place for retreats, or it could be sold and the land trust could get more money, but it's going to the land trust when I pass away.
Oh, thank you, Judy, for sharing that. Sara, a quick takeaway from you.
Regardless of where you are, whether or not you're a professional or just somebody who wants to donate their time for 5 hours a week, 2 hours a week, or whatever, I think lead from where you are. Collaboration takes a diverse skill set that is hard. You want to be able to listen without bias. You want to be able to be creative and focus on problem solving. I mean, these are things that a fully functional adult has challenges with. So I think just making sure that participate in any way that you can, and bring grace and bring understanding and bring a positivity and inclusiveness from wherever you sit. because it is going to take every single one of us to try and preserve those things that we love about our community, especially as this state grows. We're the second fastest growing state in the country right now. And so these conversations and these collaboratives are even more essential than they have ever been.
Yeah, absolutely. So we did get a couple of questions in here. Lindsay asks, with all the growth happening throughout the state, and you just mentioned it, Sarah, what are conservation priorities for, I'm probably, Regan, if you could say what your priorities are at Kaniksu, and then Sarah, if, what are your priorities in the foothills, and then how citizens can get involved, how folks can get involved in that. So Regan, why don't you start?
That's a tough question because here in North Idaho, and I know across the state, the growth is happening so quickly that it's almost like triage to prioritize what lands we have the bandwidth to focus on right now. Water is really imperative. We all need it. Our wildlife needs it. The land needs it. So riparian corridors and wetlands are a strong priority for us. Healthy forests are forests or carbon forests. They clean the air, they provide jobs. Maintaining healthy working forests is a high priority. Places for wildlife. It's hard to know when to stop. And also we've started to do some planning work around identifying landscapes that have resilience to a changing climate. So that's an area where we have to act now to identify those landscapes, because there aren't a lot of them in some areas, and they're really, really going to be essential to the future health of our ecosystems. So that's a start. How can you get involved? Reach out to your local land trust or conservation organization. Call up the executive director, ask if you can meet for coffee, offer to volunteer, or just brainstorm together. If you have a neighbor or a friend that has that owns land that seems like it's really a special place, then maybe connect with them and ask if they've ever considered conservation, or if they have a plan for, after their time, what's going to happen to their land. Will it be safe, or what do they want to see in the future?
Yeah, that's great advice. And that also goes back to, most of the work that land trusts do, it's voluntary work, right? All of it is voluntary. It takes a willing landowner to make these projects happen. So a landowner like Judy to come up and say, hey, I want to do this. Sarah, can you address that one? Growth, what are the priorities, and how can folks get involved?
Probably very similar to Regan. Almost overnight, City of Boise became a destination for folks looking to have access to the outdoors, and maybe their work situation changed. They could telework and they don't want to live in a city anymore. Not that Boise isn't a city. We're definitely the largest city in the state, but I think that the growth thing is a huge ball of yarn, and I can only really address one of those threads, because there's public safety issues, there's housing issues, there are emergency services issues, infrastructure issues, tax issues, all that, right? So I will address the open space piece, obviously the recreation piece, that one single thread. The value of outdoor access and continued preservation of those natural amenities and natural systems that human populations rely on in order to be healthy is really at the forefront of the conversations here in Boise. How do we protect clean water drinking sources? How do we preserve the connection for water quality between upland and wetland habitats that we have intact? And then how do we ensure that we can, keep those healthy populations of wildlife and allow them to continue to live their lives in their habitat? And it's a challenge. And I think we focus on education, obviously, through our programs and through the work that we do with the media. We focus on preservation and improvement. The mayor here, Mayor McLean, just signed on to a global effort to protect 30% of the world's land and water. The Biden administration has signed on to that effort, and I believe it's just been renamed America the Beautiful. And we worked really hard to figure out how we could meaningfully engage in that initiative here at the city, local municipality level. And it came down to restoring habitats, getting citizens involved in those efforts, whether or not it's that Weed Warriors program that I mentioned, or if it's helping to volunteer in a local neighborhood park to put in a pollinator garden. And it's also the City of Trees initiative that we have going on right now, trying to increase the tree canopy cover to 30% all over the city. All of these things relate to what Regan was talking about with regard to trying to preserve, what we can, when we can, and mitigate the effects of climate change. And then I think the last thing I would say is connectivity, not just for trails and human populations, but also for wildlife, and trying to balance, having this wonderful outdoor recreation opportunity. We have over 200 miles of trails in the Boise foothills that are managed through a partnership with the City of Boise being the lead agency. And we also have a critical wildlife habitat management area in the Boise foothills. So we are constantly walking on a tightrope between, serving those human populations and then also stewarding the native habitat and the wildlife populations.
Yeah, definitely taking care of that land, acquiring it and taking care of it. We don't have time for our other question from Tony, but Tony, I will follow up with you afterwards and address that one, because a lot of that question, what would your definition of the difference between conservation and environmentalists, and how does that pertain to public land access? I'll get back to you on that one, Tony. I think a lot of what's come out of the Biden administration's America the Beautiful initiative looks at those things and at the language of how different language affects people and how willing people are to do conservation work when it's called conservation versus protection or versus environmentalism. And then access as well, making sure that there's equitable access to all people. So with that, I want to thank, all of our panelists for taking the time today. Sara, Judy, Regan, thank you all so much. This has been a really fun conversation and something I've been super excited about all week. So thank you so much for being here. And then to everybody else who's, in the audience, thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking the time to learn about this work. And then again, I'll invite you to attend the rest of our Green Tie festivities. We've got those 3 more events going on today and tomorrow. And then also, you can see the whole schedule and then everything else that we have for Green Tie at cvidaho.org/Green Tie. We've also got an online auction going on right now. Green Tie is our annual fundraiser. So we've got that online auction. There's a lot of really cool items that you can bid on and support our work. And then, if you do want to support our work for Idaho, please do consider making a gift if you haven't already. Our work is made possible by individual donors. It's mostly just regular folks who are contributing to this work and making it possible. And then the last really cool thing I want to mention is that, thanks to a really generous donor, all gifts to CVI during Green Tie are going to be matched dollar for dollar up to $25,000. So if you do give a gift, it will be doubled essentially, which is really, really cool. And I think Josh is going to throw a link in the chat to that. So, thank you. Yeah, thanks for contributing and for supporting our work and for being here today to learn about the collaboration it takes to make conservation happen. So if you've got questions, reach out, and thanks for being here. All right, everybody.